Welcome to Meteor Interviews, a series of interviews with Meteor developers, community, and core team members. Today I'm speaking with Chris Mather. Chris is the founder of the software education company Evented Mind and the author of the Iron Router package, the most downloaded and most starred package on Atmosphere. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Paul.
Thanks. My goal today is to learn about how you got into Meteor and your efforts at teaching Meteor with Evented Mind. And I'm sure we'll probably touch upon Iron Router and its role in the Meteor ecosystem at some point too. So Evented Mind was the first Meteor training site. It was definitely the biggest. It was the first place for Meteor content that I knew of. And Iron Router was already mature and widely used long before Meteor was 1.0, before I got into Meteor anyway. And so you were into Meteor really early. How did you get into Meteor?
Sort of happenstance, actually. I live and work in San Francisco, and I happen to be temporarily working out of an office a couple of years ago where the Meteor team happened to be as well. I think that the office that they actually work out of was being painted or something was going on, and so they were using this temporary space. And so I just kind of randomly met the team. And I've been working on web development and software development for quite a while now. So I was familiar with some of the other approaches to the problems that they were solving. And when I jumped into the framework and started playing around with Meteor, it was just amazing right away how much you could accomplish so quickly. And they really solved quite a few tricky problems that I was inspired by. So I started building an application with it, the first version of Evented Mind, and going through the source code and trying to understand how it worked. And I've always been interested in education, which is, of course, why I started Evented Mind. And so I started learning the Meteor platform and then also teaching it as I went. And that's kind of how Evented Mind came to be.
So you were already building Evented Mind for the purposes of teaching in general, and then you decided to build it in Meteor. And so that became your first subject. Is that right?
Yeah, well, actually, I tried Evented Mind a little bit before I ever even heard of Meteor, and I created a course on JavaScript, and I put it up, and I think I sold one copy of it.
Yeah, excellent.
To some guy in Europe, and that was it. So I thought, oh, geez, I really messed this thing up. This is never going to go anywhere. And I went off and did some other things after that, and then when I discovered the Meteor stuff, I came back to it later. And I learned a little bit more at that point about how to build an audience of more than one person.
Awesome.
So yeah, it took 2 tries.
Cool. So what do you do to build an audience? Obviously, you just get the word out there, but how do you do it?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that it takes a long time. So you have to be focused on something that is inspiring to you, and to be willing to put in the time, each day to do that thing. And then, for me, it was I really enjoyed learning the Meteor framework, and I thought there was a lot of cool stuff there. And so as I learned that, I wanted to sort of get those learnings onto the video medium and share it with people. And I think the audience for Meteor was kind of growing as well. And so the two were very complementary.
Yeah. So. And when you were deciding what to build for your first episodes and your first screencast, how did you choose what to build?
Oh, geez. I had no idea what I was doing, Paul. It was very torturous. I think the first one that I did it was maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and I think it took an entire day, maybe 14 hours or something like that. So it used to take quite a long time just to even do one video. I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to just start learning, and then if I found something interesting, I would do a video on it and just put it up. And I think in the early days, I didn't have any concept of a schedule, so I just did as many as I could. So at one point, I think I was doing like 5 a week.
Yep.
And then I started to kind of get a little bit more disciplined about scheduling it. And then I think over time, I've always decided to just focus on things that I think are kind of tricky or weird or interesting. For example, the word cursor gets thrown around all the time, but what does that actually mean? I mean, what is it? What does it look like? Mm-hmm. How do I identify a cursor when I see it? And what are the behaviors that it has? And you can read about it and see the words, but until you actually see it, and you see it on the screen and you see somebody working with it, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. At least it wouldn't to me. So, we did a video on what is a cursor. We did another one early on. There was another rendering engine on Spark. And I thought, well, what is it? We say rendering engine all the time, but what does that actually mean? I mean, what should I be thinking of when I think of a rendering engine? So let's pull this thing apart and see how it actually works.
Right.
So a lot of people at that time said, well, nobody cares about how the engine works. They just want to do stuff. And, that's sort of true. I mean, sometimes you need to actually know how to just drive the car, right? But I found that most people, at least the ones who we interface with, are interested in how it works.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a stage that you get to with something. Like, I mean, first you just want to see something on the screen. You want to see some results of building something, but once you decide that you like the platform you're working with, I think it's natural that you want to learn more about it. And it's pretty cool how you go actually into some really deep stuff, but make it really accessible. So like in your screencast, you've got things like Node Inspector running, and you're kind of drawing on the screen, pointing out things, and you don't have to do the hard work yourself of actually figuring out where to go through all those things, but it's kind of like a guided tour through the internals. So I like that.
Yeah, I think also it's pretty amazing to me how much, people can actually learn if you just show them something. I think, as humans, we have a great, amazing capacity to learn a lot of stuff. I think we sell ourselves short. And if people are anything like me, the secret here is I have a terribly difficult time learning these concepts by just reading text.
I think that's I think that's everybody.
And so for me, I mean, I need to see it, and I need to see it from multiple angles to understand it. And I remember there was there's a lot of other people who are doing video work and still are, and it was inspiring to be able to watch those videos and be like, oh, I'm learning so much more in a 10-minute segment than I would by monkeying around with four different books.
So what's the most popular material on there? Which classes and courses do people go to the most?
I don't have it in front of me, but off the top of my head, the most popular blog video is the login one, and I don't know why that is, though. You could draw conclusions from that information, but it could be that it's just because it's on YouTube. It could be that it's just it's one of the things that people just really want to do a lot. Why do you think it might be?
Well, I don't know. Maybe the login. I think Meteor is actually the only framework where it's adding a really nice login system is so easy to do.
Uh-huh.
I think that's like when I do demos to new audiences that don't know Meteor yet. I always throw in a login, and just how quickly you can get that in there is really impressive.
hmm So we took that concept and we decided to make an updated building a multi-page app with Iron Meteor, and so we made a whole class around it, and it's updated for the latest release of Meteor and all that. So that's doing pretty well. You guys should definitely check that out. I think the other thing that was we decided to kind of do an experiment a while back and say, why don't we try doing some just core concepts in JavaScript? Because a lot of this stuff that happens is kind of magical, I think, for people. But then once they pull apart, like how do objects work in JavaScript? And it becomes so much more clear. And so those are quite popular as well. I think it helps people understand what's going on.
Yeah. Do you think people are coming to those from the Meteor stuff, or do you think people are coming that are not, like new non-Meteor developers are coming in for those and then being exposed to Meteor?
It's hard to track precisely, but intuitively, I think a lot of them are going to be our Meteor developers because that's where we spend most of our time, and that's where this kind of grew from. So I think they're mostly Meteor developers, but Meteor's a JavaScript, right?
Hmm.
So there's I think a desire there to understand the tools that we work with each day.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think there's also I think, Paul, that people get worried about time commitment. They get worried about, well, when should I stop learning this stuff? Can't I just call it a day? After a certain point. Um, and it's like it's the existential crisis of being in technology. It's just like, can I just relax and stop? There's a new framework coming out every day. I think the answer to that is, first of all, learn a couple of the core concepts, because after a while, all of the frameworks start to kind of do the same thing, or they overlap quite a bit. And the other is to set aside a little bit of time each week that you just call education time.
Yep.
And you're completely free. It doesn't have to be for a business purpose. It doesn't have to be for your job. It's just for fun. And maybe it's an hour, maybe it's two. If you're really obsessive like me, maybe it's 4 or 5, per week.
Yep.
to do this kind of thing. And I think you'd be surprised, at how much after a couple of months you'll know.
I totally agree. I think it pays back in terms of like having new ideas that will save you time on something that you're doing. And even if you're just learning without a goal, even if you're learning another framework or something that you don't even use, it's kind of good to have those new ideas and I think it's surprising how many times those come back to what you're doing and give you a really great idea.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's one of the reasons that we did the React class. We're not doing the React class because we're jumping to another framework just for the heck of it. We want people to look at another rendering engine so they can compare and contrast
Yep.
and see, how are the engineers who are building these things, how are they thinking about solving these problems? Because we're all engineers and we ought to think like engineering professionals and be able to make those decisions for ourselves.
Absolutely. So, which concepts do you think people have the most trouble with when learning Meteor?
Oh, good question. Um, when you first start with Meteor, you're able to do quite a bit of the things that they kind of optimized for. You can get a lot of things done very quickly.
Yep.
And then when you start building out a sort of more sophisticated application, there are some concepts in Meteor that are quite sort of simple on the surface, but are actually quite complex, like reactivity, for example.
Yep.
So I think reactivity is a pretty tricky concept. It's not intuitive what exactly it means to be reactive, and if a function is able to just rerun, what causes it to rerun, and what machinery is under there that's kind of doing that.
Hmm.
And if you start to get really complex, you're sort of asking people to keep a state machine in their head of all the different possible states. And so I think reactivity is a pretty tricky concept. When you can't see kind of a direct causal relationship between this is happening and how this is responding, and you don't have the right debugging tools to kind of see that happening, I think it can get pretty confusing. So, but that's true of any, could be true of any abstraction, really. It's just a matter of getting the right tooling in place so that we can visualize what's happening.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of other things in JavaScript, like even the concept of promises and some more kind of more complicated things to do with asynchronous programming. And I think actually reactivity allows you to use a lot of those concepts less in Meteor than you might in other frameworks. So it might actually be easier, and I think it actually is easier than some other ways of dealing with asynchronous code in JavaScript.
Uh-huh.
But still, it's a tricky thing, and it's especially something that trips people up when sometimes things are reactive and sometimes they're not, and so you have to understand if what the source of your data is and what context your function is being called within, whether it's going to be reactive or not. So yeah, it's definitely I can see that being a tricky thing.
Yeah, I think on the server side, the idea of what is asynchronous versus synchronous is very confusing as well. I mean, we did an entire class on the JavaScript runtime to really explain these concepts in detail, so that you could understand, what is the event loop, um, what does asynchronous actually mean, and what is something happening in parallel, or like two tasks happening at the same time, and I think that requires like a diagram and some explanations.
Yeah, and it's different on the server with Meteor because of fibers. So
Yeah,
I'm curious, what do you think about that? Do you think? I mean, when I first started learning Meteor, I think that was still a contentious thing.
Mhm.
To me, I love it. I think it's a great choice. But I would still read things online with people that disagreed about it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of those early, I think some of those early complaints came from some confusion about how fibers actually work. So I think one, source of conflict was, well, are you now making the what makes node node, which is the ability to do asynchronous I/O? Are you making that synchronous and therefore taking away the performance benefits that it provides?
Right.
And the answer is no, no, no. That's not what's happening, right?
Yeah.
All you're doing is you're writing in a synchronous style of code, but the ability to do I/O in the background is still there.
Yeah.
And I think that was tricky. But so, what do I actually think though about fibers? I think that's right. I think on the server, writing asynchronous code is in an asynchronous style is confusing. I think it's confusing because most of the time you want to make a request to the database, get back some data, combine that with a view, and send it to the requester.
Hmm.
You don't want to execute some other code sort of while you're waiting. So what you really want is the asynchronous I/O, but to be able to write that in a synchronous style of code. And so that's what Meteor did. But
Yep.
the problem with it is now you kind of have to understand where you need fibers, and so that's the tricky part. And so sometimes you get these esoteric errors about your code must always be run in a fiber, and it's kind of like,
Right.
well,
Like when you're using other node packages and things.
yeah. And then so of course the question is, well, what does that even mean? Do I need to know fibers to be able to use Meteor? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, it, ideally it would be handled in the node platform itself. Would probably be an easier thing for folks to understand. But I think being able to write code in a synchronous style is part of what makes Meteor really easy to get started with.
Yeah, I agree. It makes your code a lot easier to read and even to reason about when you can just make a query to the database and assign the return value to something,
Exactly.
which you cannot do, for example, on the client even. So
Right, exactly.
so I'd like to just touch on Iron Router a little bit.
Sure.
So you wrote Iron Router. That was pretty early back in I guess the early days of Meteor before I started learning Meteor.
Huh? When was
And
that, Paul? When did you start?
I started, it was about zero point 0.6, so before Blaze, but Meteor, things were still pretty mature at that point. Like there was Iron Router, there was a solution for pretty much everything.
Okay.
So yeah, there was Atmosphere, and things have changed a fair bit, but it was still fairly mature. But I imagine there was a really wild early days there when there wasn't even routing, and so you jumped in and you said, oh, okay, routing, this is the web here. This is an essential piece. Is that what happened?
Yeah, so there were I was kind of just poking around and trying to figure out, how can I contribute to this in some way, and I'd never really done any substantial open source project. And so I took a quick stab at it by creating something called Mini Pages, which was just kind of a play on Mini Mongo. And so that was the first kind of simple router that I created. And then there was another one that was created by Tom Coleman. I think it was just called Meteor Router, and I think that's what people were using.
Hmm.
And then at some point we said, well, the router really needs to have a lot more functionality. And why, if we're going to continue to build it, why do we do it on two separate paths? Why don't we just work together?
Yeah.
And I think that was a good decision because, well, it allowed the community to come together around one solution. But more importantly, I think we solved a lot of hard problems by working together. And so it was nice to have a partner, who I could work with on debugging issues or a better understanding reactivity and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So it's surprising to a lot of people that it's not part of core. I mean, it has more downloads than accounts password.
It's surprising to me, Paul.
So why isn't it?
You have to ask Meteor.
Okay,
Um,
that's it.
yeah, I think it should be in core.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious how they feel about it.
Well, I mean,
I
I think they're busy, and I think it's scary to take on, such a big project like this when, your engineering team is already working, around the clock on stuff. But, it's a web framework, and the web has URLs. So I think to not have a router in core is a mistake. And hopefully they'll do something about that. I don't know whether it means taking on Iron Router itself or building their own or some combination of that. But I'm here to help, and I think that's the right thing to do.
Yep. Yep. That's great. I do agree. I do agree that it should be a core part of the framework. Um, and I think it was a kind of an easier question like a month or two ago because it was really the only one. Now there's Flow Router. So Aeronota recently released Flow Router.
Oh yeah, what's that?
Um, well, I think the differences are actually I was hoping to ask you if you knew a bit about the differences. I think some of the main differences are that it doesn't rerun routes based on reactive changes. So I guess I have not used Flow Router, but I guess I think actually a common set of problems that people have with Iron Router, something that I've seen confuse people, is when say like your on before action hooks will rerun based on something reactive that changed.
Yeah.
So that can be a confusing thing, and I think that's one of the differences. I'm not really qualified to talk about it, but and I think the other thing is that it doesn't that I guess it's decoupled from the rendering framework. So I don't totally understand what that means since I haven't used it, but that's just one of the things that he wrote in there
Well, Iron Router is
in the document.
completely decoupled from the rendering framework too. In fact, most of the rendering stuff is in something called Iron Layout.
Yep. So would you what would you need to do to use Iron Router with for example React or some or Angular or does that even make sense? Because I know Angular
Yeah,
has its
yeah,
own
it makes
router.
total sense. It's very simple to do actually. There's like four or five, there's like four methods. That is the API contract between the router and a rendering engine of any kind. So you just need to write a very simple adapter. In fact, I've gotten it working with React as a pet project a while back, but I never pursued it.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean the reactivity in the we call it a middleware stack, kind of like what Connect has. It's essentially an array of functions that get called one in sequence, one after the other. And that's what your sort of hooks are. Yeah, I think the hook concept is confusing in Iron Router, and I think the reactivity is confusing in Iron Router as well. So I think that the trade-off there is that on the client now you're asking the users now to worry about reactivity themselves. But in most cases, that probably would reduce confusion, not create additional confusion. So I think the most common case for reactivity in the router is the user logged in or not.
Yeah.
The rest of the stuff can probably just go in the templates. So yeah, I've tossed around the idea of removing the reactivity part. I'd definitely be open to a discussion about it. I think there's a lot of things in the router that we could make better if we work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think for that specific example, I think once you know how it works, and it is well documented, like I think, for example, you actually do have some callbacks, like I think it's on run that's not reactive. I may be wrong about that, but there's one that's not. And I think once you just, once you get through that once and you realize, okay, it's Meteor, most things are reactive, I should expect that.
Yeah, one of the things that I it kind of got torn in between two kind of ways of doing things. Um, if you look at like the Express framework, which it has its own router that works, with Connect, it's basically just for each route an array of functions. It's very simple,
Hmm.
and you can just keep adding functions to this array, and then you just pass the request down the array of functions, all the way to the end, and so it's a very simple concept. It doesn't allow you to have any kind of inheritance. So in other words, like if you wanted to have a controller where you put some functions or methods on that, it doesn't work that way. It's only functions that you can pass in. So it's simpler, and I've often thought, well, maybe it would be better just to do something like that with Iron Router. So that was one kind of design choice that I'm not sure about. And what we did is we said, well, we want inheritance, and we want to be able to have classes like controllers, more like what the Rails framework has. So that's
Right.
kind of where the idea of hooks came from. But I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if that was the best decision.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's powerful and I like powerful things. I think simplicity can be really seductive, but then, you know, once you have something that is really a core piece that everybody uses, and if it's expected to work for everyone, I think it eventually has to get complex.
Yeah. I think you're right about the seductiveness of simplicity, but that doesn't mean we can't make it better and we can't learn, over time
Yeah,
and
definitely.
and strip things out that we're seeing are not required. I mean, that's what progress is about.
Absolutely.
But
So,
yeah, you have to understand the complexity to be able to do simple.
yeah,
You don't get simple by just starting with simple.
yeah.
So I think you got to understand how everything works, and then you start pulling things out.
Yeah, I mean, a good, I don't even know where this quote came from, but a good common saying is keeping simple things simple and making complicated things possible. So I think that's always a good design goal.
Hmm.
I think, I think Meteor definitely achieves that, and I think Iron Router does too. So you can definitely get started with it and do the basic stuff, and there's nothing complicated. But I think you can do anything you need. So
Well, thanks,
I
Paul.
think that's good. All right, cool. And so just a related question about that is, so recently Meteor released template level subscriptions. That was a new feature in I think 1.04. So I think it used to be really common. I mean, I know I used to use the routes to manage almost all my subscriptions, but now you can now there are some types that you would want to do on the manage it with the template. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like when you would manage subscriptions with your routes and when with the templates?
So I have to admit I haven't played with the subscription, the template subscriptions yet, but the idea, makes sense. So I can talk about it that way. I was just looking on the docs here to see if they talk about that at all. Do they? Is it in the docs anywhere?
I'm not sure where it's documented. It's like really new. It was just in 104, so I I would assume it's in the docs, but I can't say offhand. I can't find it while we're talking here.
So there's two problems that you need that need to be solved. One is where to put this stuff. So in an application, where can we consistently go to manage our subscriptions? And I think there's a number of possibilities. We can do it in the templates. We can do it in the router, and then there's the technical aspect, which is when do you rerun a subscription because the parameters have changed, or and then what's a global subscription versus what is a per route subscription.
Hmm.
And whether you put it on the templates or you put it on the router, I don't think it really matters. It's just an issue of organization. But I think that the bigger question is how do we deal with data in a Meteor application? And I think that hasn't been answered very well yet. So what I mean by that is in a typical HTTP framework, whether it be Rails or Express or whatever, you make a request to the server. The server goes to the database, grabs some data, and then it combines it with a view, and then it sends down that view to the client. And so we now call that server side rendering, but before that it was just called the web. This is how it works.
Hmm.
And so that's the idea of a controller is to be able to take data, combine it with a view, and then give it to you. And we've added this sort of third part, which is the subscriptions. Now, some of that data needs to be real time. We need to be able to keep it up to date. But I think all that data needs to be sort of controlled in one place, especially if you get to a bigger and bigger application. It gets unruly pretty quickly.
Hmm.
I think that place is it's not the router per se, but it's the controller or it's some kind of class or place where you go, okay, for this page that I'm on, this is the data that I'm going to get from the database, and this is the data that needs to be real time on this page.
Hmm.
And I think that needs to work on the client, and I think it also needs to work on the server, which it currently doesn't really. So yeah, I think there's a number of things that have to change about that, but I think that all is part of the router being pulled into core.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and I guess reusability of components has something to do with it. So I think if you're building a reusable component, then you would probably want that component to be able to manage its own data and make sure that if that component is ever used, that the right subscription is being used.
Yeah, sometimes it depends. I mean, I think there's a couple different approaches, but figuring out how data flows through your application becomes one of the biggest nightmares of managing a complex app.
Hmm.
Because you're trying to trace through what happened. So I'm not sure having data pulling from the individual components is the best way to do it. Although I think it's something that requires some discussion.
Okay. So otherwise, your route would need to know would need to know what components are going to be used and make sure that it sets up the subscription.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be okay to be like, okay, well, this component, goes. Well, okay, on this page, what I really need to know is what are all the components on the page,
Yeah.
and go to each individual component to see, which data it gets. But I think my intuition is that would get unruly pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, and that's I think that's maybe the case for the templates setting up their own subscription, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with that, to be honest. I need to spend some more time.
I think there's still a lot of design patterns that have to emerge about all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think React seem to be doing something interesting with that as well now. So it'd be probably good to take a look at that with their new data layer that they're adding.
Yeah, we're gonna dive into that pretty soon. We're about to do another class on digging deeper into React and how to integrate it with Meteor, is just to kind of give people a sense of it.
Excellent.
Yeah, so we're excited about that. But again, I think there's a lot of cool technologies here, and what we want to do is kind of raise the bar of discussion, so that we're having, we can have an educated discussion about how different engineering groups are accomplishing these goals and solving these problems, you know?
Yep. I think it's always good to keep track of what other people are doing.
Yeah.
It's good. Okay. And speaking of that, what does the Meteor community have to learn from other communities? What do you think that Meteor should be doing differently or could be doing better that other people do really well?
Well, I have to answer it sort of abstractly. I don't know in comparison to other communities, but you know, I guess just from general observations, I think that one of the most important things is it's easy to get you know it's easy to get religion about you know this is the only way to do something, and I've learned this thing, and that's just the way you know the world's going to be.
Yeah.
But then the world changes very fast. And so over time, you know, 15 or 20 years, and how many web frameworks, how many different things have we seen come and go and come and go and come and go? So I think what we need is to sort of elevate ourselves as engineers, as professionals, to a point where we're just continuously learning at a pace that is not insane, you know, but that we just recognize and accept that we're going to kind of keep learning new things.
Yep.
And I think with the Meteor community, we want to be thinking about, you know, how does this stuff work, and can we do it better? Is there a better way, or should we be, you know, monkeying with this somehow to make it better fit with what it is that we're trying to build as engineers? Does that make sense?
Totally. Yep. That's a great answer. Well, excellent. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Sure, Paul. It was great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So if our listeners would like to get a hold of you, how can they do so?
Oh, that's not possible, Paul. No, I'm just teasing. Anyone can send me an email. And you know, the people who are on GitHub, I apologize sincerely. I'm trying to figure out how to respond quickly, but sometimes I don't. So I apologize. But yeah, just send me an email. Anyone's welcome to email.
Well, with I think what is it like 99,000 downloads? I'm sure there's a lot of traffic on the on the Invented Mind repo.
Yeah, yeah. And I need a better way. I need help with it. If not from the core team, then you know, from the community. I need some more maintainers.
Yeah, that's a pretty awesome opportunity to get involved with something big.
Oh yeah, if you want to, you know, participate in Iron Router, I'm open to it. But there's a lot to understand there. And we have some classes. And if anybody wants to become a maintainer of Iron Router, I will give you the classes for free, and you can watch them and help us out.
That's an awesome offer. Well, and that actually sounds like a really great way to get really good with the internal guts of Meteor, learning all the concepts that you really need to understand. Because I think Iron Router probably touches on all of that.
Yeah, it does. It reaches into a lot of different things.
Excellent. Well, there you go. Get in touch with Chris and help out with Iron Router.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Chris.